Hello everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Freilich Lecture on Bigotry and Tolerance. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Melissa Lovell, Research Fellow at the Australian National University and convener of the Herbert and Valmay Freilich Project for the Study of Bigotry here at ANU. I would like to begin by paying my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of this Canberra region and by paying my respects to any elders who might be with us for this event. The inaugural Freilich Lecture was held in 1997, almost 2 years before the official establishment of the Freilich Project. Over more than a quarter of a century now, prominent scholars, policymakers and activists have each used the platform of the Freilich Lecture in Bigotry and Tolerance to present on some of the most important themes and problems facing Australian society. I invite you to explore some of the past lectures, many available in video format on the Freilich Project website. This year, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Malcolm Campbell to present his lecture on the topic, Are We Not Your Neighbours? Bigotry in Australian Life. This lecture is held in conjunction with the ANU Humanities Research Centre, where Professor Campbell is currently a visiting fellow. I extend a warm welcome to the researchers, staff and students of the HRC who are with us here this evening. Professor Malcolm Campbell is Professor of History at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, where he teaches Irish and Australian history and the history of empire. A graduate of the University of New South Wales, he has published widely on the history of Irish emigration and settlement in North America, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. His most recent book is the transnational study, Ireland's Farthest Shores, Mobility, Migration and Settlement in the Pacific World, published by the University of Wisconsin Press in 2022. Professor Campbell will be speaking for approximately 40-45 minutes, and there'll be time for a few questions at the end of the lecture. Please note we're recording this lecture, but not the Q&A session of the evening. Please join me in welcoming Professor Campbell for the 2023 Freilich Lecture on Bigotry and Tolerance.
Thanks very much for coming along. Can I also start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Humanities Research Centre, its director, Professor Kylie Message, and the Freilich Project for the Study of Bigotry and its convener, Melissa Lovell, for the opportunity to spend some very valuable time here at the Australian National University and for the invitation to speak this evening. Shortly after Herbert and Valmay Freilich established the Bigotry Initiative at ANU, I was fortunate to participate in a conference here in Canberra and later to take part in 2 public outreach events in Sydney and Melbourne with speakers that included Andrew Marcus, Andrew Jakubowicz and Suzanne Rutland, which was organised by my friend Benjamin Penny. These were excellent events and I learned a great deal from participating in them. I'd like to pay tribute to Herbert and Valmay's vision in recognising the importance of supporting scholarship on bigotry in its wide range of forms and to acknowledge their support of so many significant initiatives in this area. And it's been a great privilege during the course of the year to participate in a number of online webinars that have been run by the project and would really encourage people to participate in those for the breadth of material that's been covered. I remember Herbert's humility in a conversation at one of those early events when he talked about the need for humanities and social science scholars to deploy their knowledge and their skills in ensuring vigilance towards bigotry and developing a better understanding of its effects. I think the urgency to do this is as great now as it was when Herbert and Valmay first made their commitment to the study of bigotry, and I hope tonight's lecture will be of interest to both of them. Little did I realise when I booked flights to come to Australia on the 14th of October that it would prove to be a momentous day on both sides of the Tasman. In New Zealand, my home for 30 years now, the general election on that day produced a not unexpected change of government in the wake of a prolonged COVID lockdown, inflation and a strong sense of weariness. While voters in the middle ground shifted right, the political left fragmented with many of its supporters feeling that the Ardern-Hipkins government had not undertaken much needed reform to address issues including inequality. However, in my opinion, the most striking feature of the campaign and its aftermath was the extent to which some political parties invoked fears that present-day New Zealand is under threat and that the recognition of the Indigenous Maori population under the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi is unfair to Pakeha New Zealanders, and they use that to rally support. The right-wing or Libertarian ACT Party, which stands for Association of Consumers and Taxpayers, and not, as one unfortunate scholar in a mistake we would all have a nightmare about, once described it in writing as the Australian Capital Territory Party. But the ACT Party leader, David Seymour, campaigning on a policy to hold a referendum on the treaty, is quoted on his party's website as saying, "The great promise of New Zealand is that everyone's equal. Today, Labor is trying to make New Zealand an unequal society on purpose. It believes that there are two types of New Zealanders, tangata whenua, the people of the land, who are here by right, the Maori population, and tangata tiriti, those of the treaty, who are lucky to be here. No society in history," he goes on, "has succeeded by having different political rights based on birth. Many New Zealanders came here to escape class and caste and apartheid. All of the good political movements of the past 400 years have been about ending discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sex, and sexuality, and to treat each person with the same dignity. We're the first country that's achieved equal rights and has division as its official policy," Seymour said. "It's nuts." Now, the adoption of Seymour's policy of a referendum on the treaty has not yet been fully ruled out by incoming Prime Minister Christopher Luxon. In fact, Luxon's previous opposition appeared to have waned temporarily, at least in the day after the result of the Australia's Voice referendum became known. Although Googling today, it sounds like he's maybe waiting for the next public opinion poll. I don't know. Seymour proposes a referendum to unilaterally abrogate the Crown's responsibilities under the treaty and to replace it with legislation denying the status and rights of the tangata whenua. The proposed wording of the referendum includes the statement, "For the avoidance of doubt, these principles prevail over any contradictory enactment by Parliament or finding on the matter of the treaty principles by the courts." Now, I don't know legally whether this is possible, whether one party, the Crown, can abrogate the treaty, but we might find out in time. The same resentment over government measures that have acknowledged the Treaty of Waitangi and fostered partnership with Maori across a range of areas of public policy and service delivery, along with the use of te reo, the Maori language and official language in New Zealand, on bilingual road signs or in the names of government authorities, or even the use of Maori names in cities during weather broadcasts, no doubt lay behind the otherwise obscure campaign slogan of the populist New Zealand First Party. And I wandered down to the car wash near where I live and got a picture of their slogan, "Let's take back our country." Let's take it back from whom? Led by a now ageing Maori leader, Winston Peters, and courting older white New Zealander voters, New Zealand First gained 6.5% of the vote to ensure it has seats in the new parliament and perhaps to even have a seat at the cabinet table. Time will tell. We're still waiting for the final result of the election due tomorrow. The outcome of the October 14 referendum in Australia is well known to people here tonight, and I'm sure that many of you who participated in the process, followed the campaign, and have lived through the aftermath have much more expertise about the voiced referendum than I do. The coincidence of the two votes and the shared arguments in both nations denying or refuting or proposing to silence or wishing to wind back the standing of First Nations peoples is, in my mind, at least a reminder that bigotry, the subject of this lecture, does occur in national contexts, is a feature of the present, not just the past, and possesses wider transnational currents that shape the experience of particular communities that are affected by bigotry. As the writer Zach Cope has suggested, the contemporary nature of prejudice is such that it has assumed globalised proportions and vitally affects human relations in every country on every continent. But tonight I'd like to talk about an Australian history of bigotry. My interest in the study of bigotry stems back to around the time of my introduction to University of Life as an undergraduate at the University of New South Wales, and coincides with the fierce public backlash that occurred following the arrival of newcomers from Vietnam on Australian shores. Though the first arrivals began soon after the end of the South Vietnamese regime, with the landing of boats like this one, the Kien Gang, in April 1976, by the early 1980s, the hostility to new arrivals had gathered momentum and was starkly visible in the forms of vile graffiti, vitriolic public debate, and occasional acts of physical violence. On some campuses, protests occurred against the presence of racism in Australia and abroad, especially the apartheid regime in South Africa, with demands for action from university administrations. And managed to get a picture from the University of New South Wales student newspaper about a particular rally calling on the Vice-Chancellor at the time, Michael Burt, to take action. A picture outside the Morven Brown building. Some Australian academics played an unfortunate part in fanning the flames of racism and intolerance. However, many more rallied to demonstrate the extent to which racial prejudice and damaging stereotypes permeated arguments about immigration at that time. Though the controversies of the early and mid-1980s receded somewhat, I fear little attention was paid to the wounds of those who were subject to bigotry at that time, or to how they might be repaired. Recurrences in antagonism, insensitivity and hatred have proved common in the decades since. Flashpoints such as the Australian government's response to the entry of the ship MV Tampa into Australian waters in August 2001 attracted international attention, highlighting stark divisions between advocates for and opponents of the nation's response to asylum seekers. The 2005 Cronulla riots, not too far from where I grew up, demonstrated the presence of racism and Islamophobia in a suburban setting, prompting then Prime Minister John Howard to disavow the notion that Australia is a racist society. More recently, Australia's deportation of people under Section 501 of the Migration Act to countries of birth where they have no history and no meaningful connection has proved especially contentious, especially in trans-Tasman relations. But firmly fixed in my mind is the voice of a distraught Australian radio talkback caller, I think on or about Christmas Day 2001, in the wake of a Tampa affair, who, reflecting on the year gone by, despairingly said, "Australia's just not like this." And she was very distressed. My immediate response on the other side of the room is, but it is just like this. And it sowed the seeds for a long-term and still in progress project to investigate the history of bigotry in Australia. Now, I should say, in the time since then, I have done some other things, but it is a long-term project. Can we think holistically about the subject and identify issues or behaviours that have produced and sustained intolerance and hurt, including the nation's ongoing struggle to come to terms with its colonial past or colonial present, disagreement on the question of who belongs in Australia and the terms upon which those who have sought new lives on these shores ought to be accepted, whether some religious doctrines or none should take precedence over others, and how much liberty should be extended towards those whose differences in appearance, outlook or behaviour offend the sensibilities of those insistent on conformity. Can we better frame present and future debates about tolerance and intolerance with an awareness of Australia's past? Too often, I believe, the question posed in 2011 by protesting internees at the controversial Villawood Detention Centre, "Are we not your neighbours?" has been met with a rebuke or with uninterested silence. I hope to answer that question. Now, before setting out tonight to explore one small portion of Australia's history of bigotry, I should be clear about what I mean by that term. Initially used in English in the 17th century in a religious context to describe an obstinate or unreasonable attachment to a belief, the word bigotry's meaning has extended over time to include prejudgment and intolerance towards individuals and groups on a wide array of grounds, including race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and disability. For today's purposes, my focus is predominantly on bigotry's impact in the often intersecting fields of race, ethnicity, and religion, and in particular on the group that I've worked most through my academic career, the experience of the Irish. There's a rich and indispensable historical literature ranging right across these fields, from excellent scholarship on the first Australians and the colonial past to studies of Australia's immigrants, and from the investigation of Protestant Catholic sectarian conflicts in the 19th and 20th centuries through to the wider dimensions of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. However, I think it's true to say that there have been few attempts to draw this scholarship together and to think about bigotry in a more inclusive way. Now, there's good reason why we should be careful not to lose sight of the distinctive historical experience of First Nations peoples in undertaking a more universalised study of bigotry. Not all experiences of bigotry have been the same in nature or degree. However, that doesn't mean there isn't a broader picture that warrants investigation. When my Christmas talkback caller despaired that Australia is not like this, I take it she was sounding a general alarm at intolerance that includes a broad sweep of behaviours that wound the dignity of individuals and groups in this land. In thinking about bigotry, I'm particularly interested in considering whether there are specific conditions in colonial or national life that have shaped Australia's experience and why, at certain historical moments, particular population groups have borne the brunt of intolerance and discrimination. It's also important to emphasise that my objective is not to attempt to rate Australia's experience of bigotry or to offer a judgment about whether the nation's history of prejudice and discrimination is better than or worse than those of others. Although I should say that when I talk about this project with New Zealanders, they say it's going to be a really big book. And they have their own, I think, quite fixed view about their own nation's past that sometimes needs challenging. Instead, my aims are to understand better the historical experience of bigotry and what I perceive to be the discernible peaks and troughs in Australia's intolerance towards different population groups, to explore the periodisation of those shifts in momentum, and to investigate the interplay of factors that contributed to the maltreatment of those most subject to bigotry in Australian life. While many factors are no doubt at play, this evening I'd like to return to the early decades of colonial Australia's past to suggest that a deep sense of fear, the product of time, distance and isolation, helped lay the foundations for a distinctive experience of bigotry in this nation. It's interesting, I was struck by a lot of the journalism reporting on the Voice referendum that talked about the fear of voters, but I guess what I want to suggest is that the fear isn't just something that existed during the period of the campaign, but that we might see as a much more enduring feature of Australia's life. So, in his account of the establishment of the penal colony at New South Wales, Lieutenant Colonel David Collins, Deputy Judge Advocate of the newest British outpost, wrote of the convict fleet's apprehension at leaving Cape Town for the final stage of the voyage to Botany Bay. He wrote, "It was natural for the thinking part of the colonists to indulge at this moment a melancholy reflection which obtruded itself upon the mind. The land behind them was the abode of a civilised people, that before them was the residence of savages. When, if ever, they might again enjoy the commerce of the world, no one was certain," Collins wrote. And he went on to say, all communication with families and friends now cut off, they were leaving the world behind them to enter a state of unknown. And, as if it had been necessary to imprint this idea more strongly on their minds, at the closing of the evening of the day on which they sailed, they spoke a ship from London. The metropolis of their native country, its pleasures, its wealth, and its consequence, thus accidentally presented to mind, failed not to afford a most striking contrast with the object then principally in their view. And other writers, including Grace Karskens, have picked up this point about the mood, I think, of the departure and the emotions of those who were headed to Botany Bay. Anxiety, uncertainty and loss permeate these moments of departure. A little over 2 months after leaving Africa, the ships successfully rendezvoused at their destination, Botany Bay. In Collins' account, a palpable sense of relief accompanied the fleet's arrival. However, the governor, Arthur Phillip, unsatisfied with the opportunities to moor there safely, maybe too close to the airport, soon decided that the fleet should sail north to Port Jackson. Collins recorded the reception of the local people who observed these European newcomers and their coastal manoeuvring. The natives everywhere greeted the little fleet with shouts of defiance and prohibition, the words "Warra Warra, go away," resounding wherever they appeared, he wrote. In Collins' account, landfall at Sydney Cove presented a moment of novelty, activity and optimism. Convicts were brought ashore, land cleared, tents erected, exotic seedlings planted, proclamations read. Governor Phillip addressed the prisoners, promising to show approbation and encouragement to those who proved themselves worthy of them by good conduct. But those determined to act in opposition to propriety would inevitably meet with the punishment they deserved. Good order prevailed. Collins wrote, "As the woods were opened and the ground cleared, the various encampments were extended, and all wore the appearance of regularity and decorum." Collins' fellow officer, Lieutenant Watkin Tench, shared this concern with establishing orderliness. He wrote, through the unwearied diligence of those who were at the head of the different departments, regularity was soon introduced. And as far as the unsettled state of matters would follow, confusion gave pace to system. A firm commitment to the furtherance of empire, ensuring security and achieving stability marked the European outpost from the outset. However, as people familiar with the period will know, good order, regularity and tranquility did not last long. 9 convicts soon absconded, some making their way to Botany Bay to entreat the visiting French ships to take them aboard. As days passed, other newly arrived convicts seemed reluctant to work in the heat of the Australian summer, and unsurprisingly, some tools went astray. Thefts from the public stores reduced the settlement's scarce supplies. Illness and accident depleted the available workforce. Hospital tents filled. The settlement's isolation increased when the flagship of the fleet, HMS Sirius, was wrecked on the reef at Norfolk Island in March 1790. We need to move on from the view of Sydney Cove to the wreck of the Sirius. Depriving the colony of its most capable ship, desperately needed provisions were lost when the supply ship Guardian struck ice in the Southern Ocean on Christmas Eve 1789 and turned stricken towards Cape Town. As the food situation in Sydney became more desperate, on the 3rd of June 1791, the convict transport Lady Juliana arrived with 222 female convicts aboard, foreshadowing the arrival shortly afterward of a further 800 male convicts on the Second Fleet. No news was good news during the inauspicious first years of the penal colony. The foundations of Australia's history of bigotry reside in the interplay of the trays and troubles of this isolated European settlement and wider international developments at the end of the 18th century. Fast-paced economic and cultural change across the globe and the effects of war and revolutionary ideals interacted potently with the novel colonial environment that was affected by fearfulness and uncertainty. The result was an environment in which, as Kate Fulliger writes, Indigenous Australians came into contact and conflict with the vanguard of a multi-pronged and reactionary global empire. Among the newly arrived Europeans, divisions soon surfaced. Bigotry towards the Irish, who were principally Roman Catholics, and others cast as different or threatening, intensified. For the next 4 decades, the trajectory of colonial life inclined towards greater intolerance, exclusion, and retribution. As we will see, this condition continued until changed circumstances in Great Britain and Australia from the late 1820s recast at least the nominal experience of some of these groups. How and why did this come about? New South Wales, the historian Alan Atkinson wrote, was the last of a little family of settlements, the offspring of empire in the Age of Enlightenment. The rebellion of 13 of Great Britain's American colonies and the adoption of the United States Declaration of Independence in 1776 marked the inauguration of a second British Empire, a time marked not only by the evolution of a new and more inclusive British identity, but also a range of ideas and practices grounded in the transformative years of the Enlightenment. The rising of the American colonies launched a period of transformation in the Atlantic world that included the French Revolution of 1789 and the United Irish Rising of 1798. These fast-paced international developments and the spread of new revolutionary ideas coincided with a period of foment and instability in Britain and Ireland. In Britain, the population increased rapidly from mid-century, rising by 46.4% to over 8.5 million between 1751 and 1801. Economic historians highlight its experience of early and fast-paced urban concentration, such that by 1800, one-third of the population resided in urban areas. In new industrial cities, poor housing, the absence of fresh water and food, and infectious disease contributed to high levels of mortality and low life expectancy. In Ireland, the second half of the 18th century also proved to be one of fast-paced population growth and really important societal change that produced both violent agrarian protests in response to the encroachment of commercialisation. The most famous group, I think, are the White Boys from Southern Ireland, who were engaged in fighting back what they saw as the forces of modernisation, and urban intellectuals who had a very different view of the future, inspired by the Atlantic's revolutionary moment, best captured by the Society of United Irishmen. Britain's convict settlement at New South Wales felt each of these tremors during this period. One doesn't need to read very far into the records of early colonial Australia to encounter bigotry towards the Irish, Australia's first immigrant minority. Developments in Ireland provided a great deal of fuel to fire the colonial administration's anxiety. The establishment of the United Irish Society in October 1791, Wolfe Tone's powerful proclamation of the aims of the movement, and the Society's advocacy of religious equality prefaced the active mobilisation of the Society's members in Belfast and in Dublin. The outbreak of war between Britain and France in February 1793 then cast the United Irishmen's demands in a new and threatening light, so that in May 1794, General Gerard Lake began a ruthless campaign in which political prisoners were detained and thousands of weapons were seized. It's against this backdrop, on the 12th of November 1796, that New South Wales Governor John Hunter wrote to the Duke of Portland bemoaning the behaviour of Irish convicts who'd been sent to the convict colony on recent ships. He wrote, "I have at this moment an information upon oath before me of a very serious nature, in which those turbulent and worthless characters called the Irish Defenders are concerned." At a time when purposeful labourers were required, Hunter received these Irish convicts, horrid characters who, I confess, I wish had either been sent to the coast of Africa or someplace else fit for them. Matters didn't improve in the following 12 months. In January 1798, the Governor warned London, if so large a proportion of these lawless and turbulent people, the Irish convicts, are sent to this country, it will scarcely be possible to maintain the order so highly essential to our well-being. Those that we've received from that country within the last year have completely ruined those who we had received from England, who, although extremely bad, were by no means equal in infamy and turbulence to these others. The events of 1798 reinforced the colonial administration's antagonism towards new arrivals from Ireland. The United Irish Risings of that year, that ambitiously sought to transform Irish politics and loosen the shackles on religious and economic freedom, foreshadowed the abolition of the Irish Parliament and Ireland's incorporation into the United Kingdom. It also produced a large pool of dissidents to be punished. The prisoners transported to Australia in the wake of Ireland's Year of Liberty were a group that ranged from genteel, well-accomplished individuals influenced by the ideals of the French Revolution to poor rural labourers. Initially, the Governor, Philip Gidley King, saw a few signs of quality among the newcomers, but his enthusiasm for them quickly waned. King reported to his masters in London that artful and designing wretches were at work to undermine authority and stability within the colony. Religious and cultural differences, as well as fears of sedition, fueled the anti-Irish sentiment of these early colonial years. The official chaplain on the first convict fleet, the Reverend Richard Johnson, was an Anglican of evangelical leanings, nominated for his post by, among others, William Wilberforce. Johnson struggled with his ministry and returned to England in 1800 after 12 years of service in the colony. His successor, Samuel Marsden, arrived in New South Wales with his wife in 1794. Marsden shared with many fellow Englishmen a disdain for Irish Catholics, and the convict population's criminal status doubled their offence. He was sure that these were, in his words, wild, ignorant and savage men, whose presence threatened the future of the colony. Roman religion for Marsden was idolatrous, and in the convict colony merely served as a front for their rebelliousness. As one historian explained, Marsden's vision for the new society was of a one-religion state, exclusively Protestant, with Roman Catholicism and its attendant mischief bred out of the next generation of colonial children through education and active conversion. That desire for religious exclusivity predominated immediately after the 1798 Rising. The Act of Union, which took effect on the first day of the new century, responded to recent insurgency in Ireland by creating a united Parliament for Great Britain and Ireland at Westminster. Though Catholic emancipation featured in the aims of many of the proponents of the Union, and the Pitt government resigned over this issue, King George III refused steadfastly to entertain the measure that promised all subjects of the new Union equal religious footing. Interestingly, this rigidity seems not to have been maintained in Britain's Atlantic fringe colonies, where a more religiously inclusive environment seems to have prevailed. However, in Australia, as in the United Kingdom, the defect at the heart of the newly inaugurated union remained, and religious intolerance proved deep and persistent. In August 1801, King, as the acting governor, organised a public observance to celebrate the happy union between Great Britain and Ireland. I've often wondered what the Irish who were standing there, particularly the 1798 men, might have thought about this. The assembled convicts watched the ceremony that included the firing of cannons from shore batteries and ships and other demonstrations of joy. King marked the moment with some acts of clemency, releasing several Irish prisoners and seeking clarification from London about the extent of his power to grant some further pardons. However, the celebration of the Union at Sydney heralded no rapid transformation in the standing of the Irish in the colony. In fact, tensions mounted further, especially following the Castle Hill Rebellion in 1804, in which resentful convicts attempted to march on Sydney under the united Irish cry of death or liberty. Retribution against the participants was swift and bloody. Prominent among those punished were married men in their 30s who might be expected to feel most poignantly their separation from homeland and loved ones. However, some English convicts joined the prisoners too, the United Front signalling that the uprising was not a one-dimensional expression of Irish identity or national sentiment. Though the rebellion bore the imagery of Irish protest, and the Irish were certainly prominent, the colony's fearful English rulers also played their part in affirming its Irish identity. And so, surveillance of the Irish remained intense in the months that followed. In August 1804, the governor reported to London that our Irish insurgents are now quiet, but perhaps only for a short time. King expressed concern about the ongoing threat of republicanism in the colony and conspiracies that might be brought about between its Irish and Scottish proponents. In subsequent years, religious intolerance and the imposition of barriers to religious practice matched the political oppression of the Irish. The situation reflected a wider contempt for Irish Catholicism at the time. The occupation of Australia coincided with the blossoming of Protestant evangelicalism in Great Britain. As one historian commented, in the decades surrounding Cook's voyages, evangelicalism, dissenting, Methodist and Anglican, worked to discover and endow with great urgency the national mission to save debased savages from themselves, a project which cultural and imperial rivalries with France accelerated. Ireland was very much enmeshed in this project. It was a place identified by English evangelicals as inhabited by an ignorant and superstitious people, lowly and Roman Catholic, in need of religious salvation. Events around the turn of the century, including the United Irish Rising, supported by the force of Catholic defenderism, added urgency to the task of civilising the Irish, including converting them to Protestantism. A series of organisations was formed in the United Kingdom to undertake this work, including the London Hibernian Society, which was founded in 1806, the Irish Evangelical Association in 1814, and the Baptist Society for Ireland, founded the same year. Data suggests these groups enjoyed some success in evangelising across Ireland. For example, The population of Methodists in Ireland rose ninefold between 1770 and 1830. The number of Methodist ministers rose tenfold during the same period. In addition to making inroads in the countryside, evangelical fervour also took root in urban Ireland. Dublin boasted its own evangelical hub centred on Trinity College. Given the prejudice towards Irish Catholicism in the United Kingdom, it was little wonder then that Roman Catholicism in New South Wales experienced an inauspicious start. Bigotry, Zach Cope suggests, is the consequence and cause of the thoroughgoing reception of prejudicial ideology in the individual mind. In the bigoted mindset, an enemy or foe is always intended, he writes. A feature of bigotry is its ability to refocus that enemy or foe, to recalibrate in response to political, cultural, and economic conditions. In the case of early Australia and its Irish population, the level of intolerance didn't remain constant. Animosity diminished markedly, I think, in the second quarter of the 19th century. A number of factors, international and domestic, contributed to the decline of bigotry towards the Irish at this time. The coming of peace in Europe, relative, and I say relative, political stability in Ireland, because it's never a place of total political stability, I think, and growth in the size and competence of the colonial settlement diminished the anxiety that it attended the colony's earliest years. Importantly, the passage through the British Parliament of the Catholic Relief Act in 1829 set in train reforms that promoted Irish Catholic interests throughout the empire. In the case of New South Wales, two prominent Irish Catholics were appointed to significant positions in the colony soon after the passage of the emancipation legislation. Roger Terry in 1829 as Commissioner of the Court of Requests, John Hubert Plunkett followed soon after in 1832 as Attorney General. Both new arrivals had stronger connections to the successful campaign for Catholic recognition and its leader, Daniel O'Connell. At this time too, a new governor was appointed to the colony, Richard Burke, born in Dublin in 1777 to a Protestant family with landholdings in Limerick and Tipperary. O'Connell's reported to have rejoiced upon hearing the news of Burke's appointment. Within the space of just a few years, several important posts were held by Irish figures, and within a short time the religious climate of colonial society underwent far-reaching, if not permanent, change. But significant as these new appointments were, suspicion of the Irish and opposition to the Roman Catholic Church didn't entirely disappear. It was maintained in a more passive manner than before by William Grant Broughton, the Bishop of the Church of England in Australia from 1836 to 1852. However, Broughton's hopes for exclusivity and the entrenchment of his denomination's privileged position were thwarted. Legislatively, the position of the Irish Catholic population changed with, I think, the most significant reform of Richard Burke's governorship, the Church Act of June 1836. The new Act, which remained in force until 1862, legislated for the provision of state assistance to all major religious denominations relative to their number of adherents. The move, which directed state funding to support Roman Catholic institutions, effectively stripped the Church of England of any claim to superior standing in the colony. Though subject to attack, the controversial law survived as an important liberal measure, instituted by men experienced in the sectarian calumnies of Irish life and eager that old world divisions would not be replicated to the same extent in Australia. The Act set the tone for a general state disinterest in doctrinal matters that was to prove resilient in 19th century Australia. Simultaneously, the Irish-born played an assertive role in campaigning for the removal of a series of civil restrictions that existed in colonial society, or that threatened to impair their futures. Measures such as the right to sit on district councils and plans to perpetuate civil distinctions and convict standing in the census enumeration. By the mid-19th century, the bigotry towards the Irish that had characterised the early colonial years, I'm suggesting, was greatly diminished. The high proportion of the Irish in the population, Catholic Emancipation, I'm terrible at doing this. That's the Catholic Emancipation cartoon of Daniel O'Connell emerging to the House of Commons. The high proportion of Irish in the colonial population and their distribution in the colony supported more congenial relations with their British and other European neighbours than tended to be the case in most other parts of the Irish diaspora. The rural bias of Irish settlement, achieved at a great cost to Indigenous Australians forced from their lands, produced bonds of dependency in the mid-19th century that I think supported more harmonious community relations than predominated in those major international cities where most Irish migrants went. Indeed, for some, Ireland had become a sort of place of nostalgia. On St. Patrick's Day 1840, in a really well-cited editorial, the Catholic newspaper, the Australasian Chronicle, asked, "Where shall we look on this 17th day of March for proof that Irishmen have not forgot their country, save in the tavern and the tap room?" However, if things were improving for the Irish, that wasn't the case for all people. For Australia's First Nations peoples, the rapacious demand for land lay at the heart of a brutal settler colonialism. As Elizabeth Malcolm and Diane Hall have written, Australia's Irish played their part in Australia's frontier wars, though much research remains to be done to excavate those experiences and other Indigenous Irish connections. Additionally, gold discoveries in California and Eastern Australia put in motion significant Chinese migration around the Pacific world. Transoceanic currents of people and ideas contributed to the rapid rise of bigotry towards these new arrivals. Violence and the threat of violence marked the Chinese experience on both sides of the ocean, and on both sides demands soon arose for immigration restrictions, differential rights, and diminished opportunities. On both sides of the ocean, too, Irish voices numbered among those that were raised to condemn the Chinese and demand restrictions upon them. As in San Francisco, where the Cork-born businessman Dennis Carney gained notoriety at the head of the Working Man's Party of California, promising that bullets are not wanting to deal with the Chinese, 19th century Australia saw Irish migrants take leading roles in some anti-Chinese movements and seeking improved standing for themselves as privileged insiders of a white working class. Though in either context not all Irish endorsed this threatening and racist agenda, the effect was a weight of intolerance fell upon those recent immigrants from Asia and worked in some ways to mainstream the Irish. Yet, for the Irish, the respite from bigotry proved to be short-lived. Historians have recognised Henry James O'Farrell's attempted assassination of Prince Alfred during the first royal tour of the Australian colonies as marking a turning point for community tolerance towards the Irish. The shooting in Sydney on the 12th of March 1868 took place during a worldwide panic over the rise of Fenianism. Invasions of Canada by Irish Americans in April and May 1866, not all that well known, but in the wake of the Civil War, Irish migrants in Canada staged two invasions of Canada that were unsuccessful. The first one was a bit of a farce, really, where the embarrassed United States government bought train tickets to send people home. The second was a more severe matter. Aroused this sense of global concern about the effects of Fenianism. So those invasions and subsequent bombings and arms raids in Britain aroused local fears over the global reach of physical force Irish nationalism. The allegation that O'Farrell, recently cast out from a Catholic seminary, had shouted, "I'm a Fenian, God save Ireland," as he shot the prince in the back, provoked a political outcry across New South Wales, and indeed more widely. Determined to demonstrate its loyalty to the Crown, the colonial parliament passed legislation to outlaw activities it regarded as seditious, and that included affecting the range of public speech. The O'Farrell furor signalled a fracturing of the goodwill that had been generated in previous decades. While fears of the Fenians undoubtedly played a role in igniting a more incendiary environment from 1866, a really narrow focus on the spectre of Irish nationalism, I think, fails to adequately explain the deterioration in community relations that occurred at this time. And with limited time available, I only want to highlight two particular things that I think, and have thought for a long time, warrant further investigation. The first is the increasing level of Irish migration to the Australian colonies. In fact, the 3 decades, 1850 to 1880, marked the peak years of Irish migration to Australia. Almost 250,000 Irish migrated to Australia and New Zealand during this time. Second, the surge in intolerance occurred at a time of significant demographic and economic change. In Eastern Australia, the 1870s marked the beginning of a wave of expansion in manufacturing, with a near doubling in the numbers of Australians employed in industry between 1870 and 1880. With this economic reorientation came an increase in the proportion of the population resident in the largest urban centres. Whereas in 1871, 46% of the population of New South Wales was resident in urban areas, by 1881, 58% of the colony's population lived in major towns or cities. Most of that increase occurred in Sydney, where the population increased by nearly 300% between 1861 and 1881. In Victoria, the proportion of the colonial population resident in urban areas also rose substantially in the 1860s, and the population of Melbourne continued to rise in the 1870s. Even the smaller Australian cities increased at this time. Together, escalating numbers of immigrants, urbanisation, and changes in colonial Australians' ways of living created conditions that were ripe for the escalation of anti-Irish sentiment and for the advocacy of discriminatory measures. Relations between the Irish and their Australian neighbours remained volatile for decades to come. The flammable mixture of Irish nationalism and Roman Catholicism needed little to ignite it during the 1880s and the 1890s. Later, the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin and bitter debate over conscription for war service raised fresh concerns about the loyalty of the Irish and new warnings of the threat posed to national life by their presence. The perception of the Irish as turbulent and worthless characters proved difficult to erase well into the 20th century. So, what does all of that mean? I've tried to show in a brief and limited way that bigotry in late 18th and 19th century Australia was the product of interplay between local conditions and wider global forces. I've also tried to suggest that we should interrogate the levels of interdependence between different groups and their experiences of intolerance, discrimination, and maltreatment. Why do I think this is important? As a younger person observing the hostile reception of the Vietnamese in Australia, I hope that knowledge and education and the raising of voices of goodwill by their new Australian neighbours would contribute to a more tolerant society and challenge the bigotry that was prevalent at that time. I still hold that hope, and the need remains the same. In his 2020 Australia Day message, the former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, I think he was speaking as Prime Minister on this occasion and not as any other sort of minister, said, "Whether our families came here tens of thousands of years ago, generations ago, as mine did on the First Fleet, or those who are taking citizenship for the first time today, we're all together as one and we can all be proud." Morrison's affirmation of national unity wasn't and isn't unusual, but it is ahistorical. Whether in the treatment of its First Nations peoples, its national or religious minorities, including the Irish, or many other groups, Australia's past has not been one characterised by unity and cohesion. Bigotry has been an enduring stain upon our national life from the time of European occupation in 1788 through to today's egregious treatment of many of those desperately in need of asylum. It's important that knowledge of this past informs our thinking and decision-making in the present, not because the past is a reliable guide to present action, but because the perspective of history helps us to better understand our lives and our communities and to work towards repairing the deep wounds that have been inflicted by bigotry. Thank you.